Most people think of Canada as a young nation, a place built in the 20th century, with its cities still smelling of fresh timber and frontier ambition. But hidden across this vast country, from the gray shores of the Atlantic to the rain-soaked coasts of the Pacific, sit towns that have endured for nearly 500 years. These are places where European footsteps first fell on North American soil, where winter came and never quite left, where fortunes were made and lost on rivers of fur and timber and fish. They are older than your country probably thinks, older than the railways, older than the national anthem. In this video, we are counting down the 10 oldest towns in Canada that still exist today. Towns that survived plagues and wars and the slow strangulation of changing trade routes. Towns that watched empires rise and fall on their doorsteps and somehow remained. Stay with me to the end, because number 1 is a place so old, so impossibly persistent, that it has watched the entire story of European North America unfold around it. The story of how the wild North was won, or at least settled. So hit subscribe, and let's begin. Number 10. Ville Marie, Quebec, founded 1642. If you drive up the St. Lawrence River in the dead of winter, when the ice thickens and the world turns silent, you eventually pass a place where 2 rivers meet in an ancient cold. This is where Montreal began. Not the Montreal of glass towers and underground metros, but Ville Marie, the City of Mary, a small religious settlement built on the island of Montreal in 1642 by a group of devout French colonists who believed they were building a holy commonwealth in the wilderness. The frozen river was their only highway, the dense forest their fortress. Paul de Chaumady, Sieur de Maisonneuve, landed with fewer than 50 settlers and a vision of converting the Haudenosaunee and Algonquin peoples to Christianity. The settlement was impossibly fragile, surrounded by hostile nations, cut off from France by 6 months of ice and wind, fed by supplies that might never arrive. But it grew. Slowly, stubbornly, it accumulated families and traders and soldiers. By the late 1600s, Ville Marie had become the heart of the North American fur trade, with canoes arriving from the interior bearing beaver pelts that would make fortunes in Paris and London. The trade transformed everything. The Holy City became a rowdy frontier post. Taverns opened. Fur merchants built stone houses. The indigenous peoples who the settlers came to convert became their most critical trading partners. And then, as disease and displacement ravaged their populations, witnesses to their own erasure. Today, Old Montreal preserves the narrow cobblestone streets of Ville Marie, the stone warehouses where furs were stored, the cathedrals built by men who believed they were saving souls. The St. Lawrence still flows past, colder and quieter now than it was in the age of canoes. Walk those streets in the silence of a winter evening, and you can almost hear the creak of wooden boats and the low voices of men counting beaver pelts by candlelight. Number 9. Trinity, Newfoundland, founded 1545 deep in the easternmost reaches of Canada, on a peninsula that juts into the Atlantic like a defiant fist, sits a small village of salt-weathered houses that cling to a rocky harbor as if they might be swept away at any moment. This is Trinity, one of the oldest settlements in all of North America. If you stand on its waterfront on a gray morning, with the wind cutting off the sea, you can almost see the cod boats that made this place matter. Trinity was settled by English fishermen in 1545. Not by explorers seeking gold or empire, but by ordinary men who smelled opportunity in the North Atlantic. Cod, the medieval gold of the sea. Europe was starving for it, and Trinity's harbor was one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. For more than 300 years, Trinity was a seasonal fishing post that swelled with boats every spring and emptied every fall. Merchants built homes here. Shipyards operated. The harbor was a chaos of nets and shouts, and the constant stink of salt and fish blood. But by the 1800s, the cod stocks began to fail. Overfishing, climate shifts, and the rise of larger fishing fleets elsewhere slowly drained the life from Trinity. The seasonal workers stopped coming. The merchants moved away. The shipyards fell silent. Today, Trinity is a village of perhaps 500 people, a kind of living museum of Newfoundland fishing life, with restored colonial homes and a quiet waterfront where you can still see a few small boats tied to the weathered wharves. The North Atlantic still crashes against the rocks. The wind still carries the salt and the grief of disappearing fish. Walk through Trinity in the off-season, when the tourist boats have gone, and you stand in the presence of a place that survived by becoming a memory of itself. Number 8. Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. Founded 1753. On the south shore of Nova Scotia, where the Atlantic throws itself against granite headlands and spruce forests pressed down to the water's edge, sits one of Canada's most perfectly preserved colonial towns. Lunenburg was not built by accident. It was designed. In 1753, the British Crown wanted to establish a stable, Protestant settlement on the Nova Scotia coast to counter French influence. They recruited settlers from Germany, Switzerland, and France, Protestant foreigners who were promised land and the freedom to farm and fish. Lunenburg was laid out in a careful grid, with streets of uniform width and plots of land distributed with bureaucratic precision. It was planning meets wilderness, empire meets frontier. The town thrived on fishing and shipbuilding. The Lunenburg fishing fleet became legendary. Sleek wooden schooners that could chase the Grand Banks cod in all seasons. The town's shipyards built vessels that sailed to every corner of the Atlantic. By the 19th century, Lunenburg was wealthy enough to build elegant homes with elaborate Victorian details, ornate churches with tall steeples, and a waterfront of substantial warehouses and fish processing plants. But like Trinity and 100 other fishing towns, Lunenburg felt the slow decline of the cod fishery in the 20th century. The great fleets moved away, the processing plants closed, the young people left for cities with jobs that didn't depend on the temperament of the sea. Today, Lunenburg is a tourist destination, a place to see authentic colonial Canada, to walk streets lined with 19th century buildings painted in deep blues and reds, to eat fish and chips at a waterfront restaurant. The Bluenose 2, a replica of the famous fishing schooner, sits in the harbor as a reminder of vanished glory. The houses are preserved because they are old, not because they are lived in the way they were meant to be. Lunenburg survives by becoming a performance of its own history. Number 7. St. John, New Brunswick. Founded 1631, where the Bay of Fundy churns with the highest tides in the world, and the reversing falls of the St. John River pour inland with such force that the river appears to flow uphill, sits one of Canada's oldest port cities. St. John was established in 1631 as a French fur trading post, a place where men arrived seasonally to trade with the Mi'kmaq and collect furs for shipment to Europe. For most of its early history, it was barely more than a warehouse on a tide-swept shore, a place people came to do business and then left. But the city's fortunes changed dramatically in 1783, when the American Revolution ended. Thousands of loyalists, British colonists who refused to accept American independence, fled north with whatever possessions they could carry. Suddenly, overnight almost, the small trading post became a refugee camp. 14,000 people arrived in a single year to a place that had no capacity to receive them. They built shelters in the cold. They died of disease and starvation through the brutal winter, but they stayed. They built the city. Within decades, St. John became one of the great maritime cities of the British Empire, a center of shipbuilding and timber export, with tall wooden ships constructed from New Brunswick pine launched into the Bay of Fundy to carry goods to every corner of the world. Fortunes were made. Grand Victorian houses rose on the hillsides overlooking the harbor. St. John was prosperous, busy, essential. The 20th century changed everything. First, the wooden ships gave way to steel. Then steel ships came to be built elsewhere. The timber industry that had fed the shipyards began to decline. The jobs left. The young people left. The grand houses on the hills deteriorated. St. John's downtown became a place of empty storefronts and weathered red brick buildings. Today, the city has reinvented itself as a cultural destination, a place where the riverside walks are beautiful again, where creative people have moved into the old buildings and opened galleries and restaurants, where tourists come to see the reversing falls and take pictures of the dramatic tidal phenomena. But there is still an undercurrent of sadness in St. John, a sense of a place that was great and then wasn't, that was essential and then was forgotten. The Bay of Fundy still churns its tides. The ancient rhythm of the sea continues, indifferent to human success and failure. Number 6. Quebec City, Quebec, founded 1608. To stand on the terrace of the Frontenac Hotel in Quebec City is to understand something fundamental about North America's oldest permanent French settlement. Before you lies the vast expanse of the St. Lawrence River, and across the water, the landscape of Quebec extends in rolling forests to the horizon. Behind you, the narrow streets of the old city climb upward toward the cathedral, and the convents, and the museums housed in stone buildings that are older than North American independence. Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec in 1608 as a fur trading post, a place of warehouses and barracks perched on the riverside bluff. But unlike the seasonal fishing posts of the Maritimes, Quebec became a permanent settlement. Soldiers, traders, missionaries, and families arrived and stayed. They built homes, they married. They had children who grew up knowing no other place as home. By the mid-1600s, Quebec was the capital of New France, the center of an empire that stretched from the St. Lawrence to the Mississippi and beyond. The fur trade enriched the city. The church built institutions, convents, hospitals, schools. The governor ruled from Quebec. The city was a miniature Paris in the wilderness, with its narrow streets and dense buildings, and the constant activity of merchants and priests and soldiers conducting the business of empire. Then, in 1759, the British Army besieged the city. General Montcalm's forces held the height against the British under General Wolfe. The two commanders died in the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. The British took Quebec. New France became British territory. The capital's role changed. For the next 200 years, Quebec was a fading echo of its former importance. Still a beautiful city with its European architecture, still proud of its French heritage, but no longer the center of North American power. The power moved west, to Montreal, and then to Toronto and beyond. Quebec became a place where the past was more vivid than the future, where tradition mattered more than progress. The 20th century almost destroyed it. In the 1960s and 1970s, urban planners and developers eyed the old city with plans for modernization, tearing down the old buildings and replacing them with modern structures. But a preservation movement stopped the demolition. Quebec City was recognized as a World Heritage Site. The narrow streets were protected. The old buildings were restored. Today, Quebec City is one of the most beautiful cities in North America, a place where you can walk medieval streets and eat in restaurants housed in buildings where people have lived and worked for 300 years. Tourists flood the cobblestones. Cameras click. People take selfies in front of the cathedral. The city survived by becoming a museum of itself, a monument to a past that Canada has tried hard to move beyond, and yet cannot quite forget. Number 5. Halifax, Nova Scotia, founded 1749. If Montreal was the capital of French North America, and Quebec City was the heart of French cultural life, then Halifax was something different. A fortress city, a naval base, a place built by empire for the purposes of war. Halifax was founded in 1749 as a British military stronghold, a way to counter French power in Nova Scotia and secure British control of the Atlantic coast. General Edward Cornwallis arrived with 2,500 settlers, soldiers, craftsmen, and colonists, with orders to build a defensible town on an ice-free harbor. They built in haste. The streets were laid out in a grid pattern. A fortress was constructed on the hill overlooking the harbor. Barracks were erected. Supplies were stockpiled. Halifax was built as an instrument of imperial power, and it lived by that purpose for more than a century. During the American Revolution, Halifax was the base for British naval operations. During the War of 1812, it was the point from which British ships harassed American merchant vessels. During the Age of Sail, it was one of the great naval ports of the world, with the constant movement of warships and merchant vessels and privateers. The citadel, The massive star fort that dominates Halifax's center stands as a physical reminder of that military purpose, a structure built to project power and control, to say to anyone approaching from the sea that this harbor belonged to empire. But empires change. The age of sail ended. Naval power moved elsewhere. The 20th century brought economic decline to Halifax. Young people left for more prosperous cities. Whole neighborhoods fell into disrepair. The waterfront, once the heart of the city, became a place of abandoned buildings and empty docks. Then, in the late 20th century, Halifax reinvented itself. The waterfront was redeveloped into restaurants and shops and museums. The historic neighborhoods were restored. Universities expanded, bringing students and energy back to the city. Today, Halifax is a vibrant maritime city, still military, a major Canadian naval base, still historic, with its museums and preserved colonial buildings, but also young and cultural, and alive in ways it hadn't been for decades. The harbor still reflects the light off the water. The citadel still overlooks the streets. But where there was once only faded memory, there is now a city that works, that grows, that makes a future for itself. Number 4. Kingston, Ontario, founded 1783. At the point where Lake Ontario meets the St. Lawrence River, where the landscape transitions from the Great Lakes to the boreal forests of eastern Canada, sits Kingston, a city with one of the most complicated histories in Canada, a place that has reinvented itself so many times that its citizens seem unsure which version of their city is the true one. Kingston was founded in 1783 as a military settlement by Loyalists fleeing the American Revolution. Like St. John, it was built by people with nowhere else to go, people who had sided with the British Crown and found themselves refugees in a land they didn't yet know. But Kingston was always different from the other Loyalist settlements. It had geographic advantages. It sat at the junction of two major waterways. It was on the route between Montreal and the vast territories of the Northwest. It was positioned to become something important. By the early 1800s, Kingston was a thriving port, a place where fur traders, timber merchants, and military officers did business. Fortifications were built to protect the harbor. The British invested heavily in Kingston's defenses. When the Rideau Canal was completed in 1832, a water route from Ottawa to Kingston and on to the Great Lakes, the city's importance grew. Kingston became the gateway to the Canadian interior, the place where goods from the west were transshipped to the east. Shipyards were built. Banks were established. Wealthy merchants built elegant stone houses on the streets overlooking the harbor. By the mid-19th century, Kingston was briefly even considered as a capital city for the United Canadian Provinces, a moment of historical possibility that passed to Quebec and then Ottawa. The city's fortunes rose and fell with military necessity and economic whim. The Navy brought prosperity. The closing of shipyards brought decline. The rise of larger harbors to the west, Toronto and then others, meant that Kingston's role as a gateway was diminished. Today, Kingston is a military city with a university, a place where the 19th century architecture is beautiful and well preserved, where you can walk streets lined with stone buildings from the Loyalist era and see the Kingston Penitentiary, one of Canada's most famous prisons, perched on a peninsula overlooking the harbor. The city is comfortable in its history. It doesn't pretend to be something it isn't. It is content to be old, to preserve the buildings and the stories, to educate its youth in universities housed in historic buildings, to maintain the military presence that has defined it since its birth. The lake still laps against the shore. The Rideau Canal still carries pleasure boats where merchant vessels once passed. Kingston endures, not by becoming something new, but by refusing to forget what it was. Number 3. Trois-Rivières, Quebec, founded 1634. Between Montreal and Quebec City, where the St. Maurice River joins the St. Lawrence, lies a city whose very name describes its geography. Three rivers, though it is actually the islands in the river's mouth that create the illusion of three channels. Trois-Rivières was founded in 1634 as a fur trading post, a place even smaller and more precarious than Quebec City in its first years. The settlement consisted of a few wooden buildings, a garrison of soldiers, and a handful of traders. The indigenous peoples of the region, the Atikamekw and the Mauricie Innu, controlled the interior. The French at Trois-Rivières were entirely dependent on their willingness to bring furs down the St. Maurice River for trade. For more than 100 years, Trois-Rivières remained small and marginal, a way station between the two larger French settlements. But then everything changed. By the late 1600s and through the 1700s, the St. Maurice River became the access point to vast territories of forest. French explorers pushed inland, and Trois-Rivières became the place where furs from the deep interior were gathered and shipped downriver to Quebec and on to France. By the early 1800s, the forest itself became the commodity. Logging operations pushed deep into the forests of the Mauricie. Timber, white pine, red oak, birch, was cut, floated downriver, and shipped to markets in Britain and the United States. Sawmills were built along the St. Maurice. The sound of saws and the splash of logs in water became the constant soundtrack of the city. Trois-Rivières grew wealthy. Merchants built homes. The city expanded away from the riverfront. By the 20th century, Trois-Rivières had evolved into an industrial center. Pulp and paper mills lined the river, drawing logs and converting them into newsprint for the American newspaper industry. The mills employed thousands. The city was prosperous, busy, essential to North American industry. Then, like so many resource-based communities across Canada, Trois-Rivières felt the slow collapse of its economic foundation. The pulp and paper industry declined. Mills closed. Young people left for cities with more diverse economies. The waterfront, which had been a place of constant industrial activity, became a place of abandoned mills and contaminated soil. For decades, Trois-Rivières struggled, economically diminished, psychologically uncertain about its future. But in recent years, the city has begun to reinvent itself. The waterfront is being restored. The contaminated land is being cleaned up. Artists and small businesses are moving into the old industrial buildings. Tourism is growing. The city is trying to become something different, not a resource extraction center, but a cultural and creative hub. It is a difficult transition, the kind of reinvention that many old industrial communities across North America are attempting. Whether Trois-Rivières will succeed, whether it can become a thriving city in an economy that no longer needs the things it once produced, remains uncertain. The St. Maurice River still flows past. The old mill buildings still stand, monuments to an industrial age that has passed. Trois-Rivières exists in the tension between what it was and what it is trying to become. Number 2. St. John's, Newfoundland. Founded 1497. On the eastern tip of North America, where the Great Circle shipping routes from Europe first approach the continent, and where the weather arrives as a constant assault of wind and fog and cold, sits the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in North America. St. John's was founded in 1497, nearly 500 years before Canadian Confederation, when John Cabot arrived on the coast of Newfoundland and claimed the land for the English crown. For the first centuries of European colonization of North America, St. John's was the gateway. Ships from Spain and Portugal and France and England arrived at the harbor with one purpose: to fish. The cod stocks of the Grand Banks were the richest in the world. A single boat could fill its hold with dried cod in a season. The profit was extraordinary. By the early 1500s, European fishing boats filled St. John's Harbor every spring, a chaos of vessels, languages, and nationalities, all drawn by the promise of cod. The city that grew up around the harbor was rough and temporary. People didn't come to stay. They came to fish and make their fortune and leave. Fortifications were built to protect the harbor from raids. Fires burned the wooden buildings repeatedly. St. John's was destroyed and rebuilt many times. And yet, despite everything, a permanent settlement took root. Irish Catholics arrived, fleeing persecution. English Protestants arrived, seeking opportunity. They married, had children, became rooted. By the 1700s, St. John's had a permanent population. A cathedral was built. Shops and taverns and warehouses were established. The city became not just a fishing post, but a place where people lived, had families, died, and were buried. Through the 19th and into the 20th century, St. John's remained the capital of Newfoundland, a maritime city whose entire economy and identity were built on fish. The harbor at St. John's is a severe landscape, narrow, rocky, surrounded by hills of bare stone and stunted vegetation. The water is dark and cold. The wind is constant and harsh, and yet this place persisted. It survived storms that destroyed the fishing fleet. It survived wars that used it as a strategic military base. It survived the slow industrialization of the fishing industry. It survived the rise and then the collapse of the cod fishery. When the northern cod fishery finally crashed in 1992, decades of overfishing had depleted the stocks below the point of recovery. The bottom fell out of St. John's economy. Thousands of fishermen found their livelihoods gone overnight. The city that had been built on cod became a place without its foundation. Young people left. Houses were abandoned. The future seemed bleak. But St. John's refused to disappear. The city pivoted. Oil was discovered offshore. The oil industry created new jobs, new wealth, new reasons for people to stay. The downtown was revitalized. Young people returned. Universities and cultural institutions expanded. Today, St. John's is experiencing a renaissance, a young, vibrant city with music and art and a complicated relationship with its past. The harbor is still dominated by the sea. The fog still rolls in and erases the land. The weather is still punishing. But the city endures, scarred by its history, transformed by necessity, but still standing on the rocky shore where John Cabot arrived 500 years ago. To walk the streets of St. John's is to walk through layers of time compressed into single blocks, centuries of history built on top of each other, each layer marked by the purposes of different eras. To stand on Signal Hill overlooking the harbor and feel the wind off the Atlantic is to understand something about persistence, about how a place can survive almost anything if the people in it refuse to leave. Number 1. Quebec City, Quebec, founded 1608. Wait, you're expecting me to say this is Quebec City again. But I said Quebec earlier, at number 6. And that's the thing about Quebec City. It's not just one of Canada's oldest towns. It's the oldest town where North American history happened in ways we still can't escape. It's the place where everything that matters about Canada's relationship with its own past comes into focus. Let me explain why Quebec City doesn't just deserve to be on this list. It deserves to be the culmination, the conclusion, the place where all of the stories we've been telling resolve into their deepest meaning. When you stand in old Quebec City, truly stand there, on the Rue sous la Fort, with the narrow buildings pressing in from both sides, and the cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. You are standing in the oldest continuously inhabited European city, north of Mexico. Not just a trading post, not just a fortress, a city, a place where people arrived and decided to live, to build, to create a society that could last. Samuel de Champlain arrived in 1608 and chose this spot, a high bluff overlooking the St. Lawrence River, a place defensible and spacious enough to grow. He built a warehouse first, then a residence, then a chapel. Others arrived. By the 1650s, there were convents and a cathedral. By the 1700s, Quebec was a city of stone buildings and narrow streets, with a European character that seemed transplanted directly from Paris or Lyon. The fur trade made it rich, the church made it holy, the military made it strategic. For more than a century, Quebec was the capital of North American Empire, first French, then briefly contested, then British. The city you see today is largely the city of the British colonial period. The buildings, the layout, the institutions that were consolidated after the British conquest in 1759. But the culture, the language, the DNA of the place is French. And that contradiction, that this oldest English-speaking city in North America is French-speaking, that this place built on British military victory houses a culture that has never accepted British dominance, that Quebec City is a place where empire came but could never fully conquer, is the contradiction that defines not just Quebec City, but Canada itself. Quebec City is the place where Canada had to learn that it couldn't be a simple British nation. It had to be binational, bicultural, a place where French and English had to coexist. And for most of Canadian history, that coexistence has been fraught, difficult, sometimes poisonous. But it was necessary. Quebec City survived the British conquest because its people refused to assimilate. It survived the 20th century's relentless pressure to modernize and homogenize because its citizens fought to preserve what made it distinct. Today, Quebec City is simultaneously three things. It is the most European city in North America, a place where you can walk medieval streets and feel like you're in France. It is a living monument to Canada's founding contradictions, a place that embodies the tension between French and English that runs through Canadian history like a seam of ore. And it is a beautiful city, struggling with the question of how to be modern and preserve its past at the same time. The walls still stand. The cathedral still rises above the rooflines. The narrow streets still twist upward and downward in the patterns laid out 400 years ago. But beyond the walls, beyond the preserved historic center, the modern city expands. Shopping centers and office buildings and highways. The tension between preservation and progress is constant and unresolved. And that, ultimately, is why Quebec City matters most. Not because it is the oldest, not because it survived the longest, but because it embodies the deepest question that all of Canada's oldest towns face. How do you move forward when you are bound to your past? How do you honor what you were while becoming something new? How do you live in a place haunted by the people who came before you and the decisions they made that shaped everything that followed? Quebec City doesn't have a clear answer. It exists in the tension between these questions. The St. Lawrence River still flows past, deep and cold, carrying with it the weight of all the centuries that have passed. The wind still cuts down the streets. The bells in the cathedral still ring, and in that persistence, in that refusal to disappear even when the forces of history and economics have tried to sweep it away, Quebec City stands as a monument to something that is harder to define than simple survival. It stands as proof that the past isn't something you overcome. It's something you live inside of. It shapes you whether you acknowledge it or not. And sometimes, the oldest places in a nation are the ones that teach us the most about who we really are.